So let's start out. Tell me about this new book that you've published.
Okay. I presume you're talking about the one I directly...
Yes.
Witness Protection. All right. Many years in the making. When I first started as a writer of the born-again Christian genre, I got caught up in the hoopla of... I nicknamed it snake handling without the snakes. And, I watched a lot of jumping jacks in the front row, and Darlene Zschech's music career took off, and Michael W. Smith did this with his, music and was on Saturday Night Live a few times. So I was right in the front row as a recovering Catholic with all that. And I remember thinking, okay, if my movie making is going to go from imitating Pop World, which at the time was Star Wars and Quantum Leap, every script I wrote sounded like Star Wars or Quantum Leap, for better or worse. I looked at what seemed to be a hot button in the church. What was the single most controversial topic that could make the crowd gasp at a moment's notice? And that happened to be porn. You could have a guy walking into a church with a heroin needle sticking in his arm, and the ushers and the greeters would be, "Praise the Lord, brother," and they give him a hug, and there was compassion up the wazoo for that. But when it came to anything remotely sexual in nature, it was, and it seemed like even the pastors were terrified to go there topically. And I thought, well, what better way could we deal with this than a courtroom drama? And I remember thinking when I had seen The People versus Larry Flynt, I thought, they could dig a lot deeper with this. How would this look from a perspective of, and instead of it being sarcastic, just look at it objectively. They kind of went there in that movie, but they didn't really go there. And that was just the perspective that the filmmakers elected to take. So I combined my own experiences having a hard time finding work. And I remember I called them the refugees. I would touch base with some folks at a church. It was a Calvary Chapel in Central California. And a lot of the former performers would come in, and they would seek grace. And the pastors were very good about that. I mean, there was, they didn't, beat them up at all. In fact, they really downplayed it. When I said I wanted to interview one of them, they were like, "Not a chance in hell. This person is entitled to the privacy." And I respected that, but I also looked at it and said, how many performers would still have chosen to do that profession had they an opportunity to do something else? And I spent my own time witnessing what I like to call the minor leagues of the industry in the strip clubs. This is years before I met my wife. And I saw a lot of really smart kids being forced because of tax dependency laws to sort of drop out of college. And the only place they could really find work was in these clubs where they would then get drafted into the camera angle of it. And then, of course, addiction did play a role, or any other number of mental illness played a big role, too. Most of them were just trying to survive economically. They were literally dancing for laundry money. Many of them had 3 or 4 kids. So when I began examining, from an objective point of view, what really made this such a controversial topic in the church, and what it really came back to was the church had decided to re-implement circumcision. Because I looked at it, well, wait a second. We look at what Jesus says about lust and adultery, but is that applicable when we animate Jessica Rabbit? What happens when it's animation? What happens when it's spouses separated by, they're communicating like this, and it's webcam, and one of them's overseas, and they're literally having Skype sex? Is that a problem? And I looked at it objectively, and I thought, well, what does what were his words based in when he was talking about it? Turns out he was addressing wife swapping among the Pharisees. He was addressing sanitary issues. And the best excuse I had heard from the pastor that married my wife and I was, we were embarrassing God if we engaged in certain things. So I thought to myself, I want to nail this in the most interesting way I could. And what I did is I used the same formula that they used for Rocky. What if you have the lottery ticket? What if you had that one? What would be a legal testimony that would be a threat to an entire industry? Now, my screenplay, when it first started out, that became was predating the webcam. So I had to choose to make it a time-sensitive piece, if you get my drift. So some of the stuff that I have in there now is outdated from like 2009. The webcam forced the bankruptcy of a lot of the commercial production companies. Many of them even left the state. But I thought, well, what if we focus on the sanitation issue, meaning it's unsafe to do some of the things that they're doing. and they're exposing the employees to unsafe work conditions. Would you have sex with somebody you knew had a life-threatening illness? Obviously, we have professions like police and fire, but there's some attempt to protect themselves. And I thought, what would be a really cool story to say, okay, how do we talk about this topic in church? Where we needed to give the holier than thous a prayer target because they were getting all the information wrong. And I thought we need a frame of reference, a place to start with this. And I thought, well, what movie would I watch? And it was, okay, porn ends, and then witness protection and the whole metaphor of God protecting his witness. And then I had to go into, how would I tell this story? And it turned out the character needed to be cared about, so I had to build a family that cared about him. It's really a woman's industry. It's really a woman's story. So it's his life, but it's from the perspective of his mom, his sister, and his wife. And then it's him telling the story as an older guy who has succeeded without any help from Hollywood. He desperately wanted Hollywood, and God said, no, I have different plans for you. And that struck me as not only ironic, but everybody I met seemed to relate to it a bit. And then I threw things in that made his world fit together more. My goal with this is actually to address the tax dependency issues. Are you aware of that news story with a young woman, her last name is Canning? She's the private Catholic school girl who's suing her parents for tuition. You know what I'm talking about? It's been in the news the last, 10 days.
You don't mean the porn star at Duke University?
This is a young lady. This is just in the news like in the last week. Okay. She sued her parents for tuition, and I think the last name is Canning. It's been on ABC News for the last couple of days. Anyway, it's the identical story where this particular demographic of kids that are raised to go to college and get their degrees and go out and be the leaders in the free world, they fall short economically. They can't get there. So they wind up being the unlimited resource for an industry that is then judged by the church. Meanwhile, there's other aspects of this that I talked about, again, from a legal point of view. Why is this considered morally wrong? Why is it legally filtered? I wanted to take a good look at this stuff. What was the difference between obscenity and sexual expression? And then in the novel, I thought it was a good idea. Well, why don't we have the federal government order the states to eliminate all sex from the Bible? Edit your Bibles. Well, that might result in something like a civil war. And I looked at it and I said, well, this is the same case that was made with slavery years ago. 10th Amendment versus the 14th Amendment. And slavery just happened to be an incidental issue in that. And then I started studying Lincoln's approach to winning over his Southern votes. And I thought, what if they did sacrifice the free speech aspect of the Constitution in exchange for we're going to totally eradicate and eliminate this part of the economy? And then I thought, well, who's really got a big stake in it? And suddenly these mythical European mob forces became my villain. That's how the novel came together. And so I thought what I'd like to do is create a way to replenish the college scholarship fund, like the Perkins loan stuff, for kids to have a fighting chance if they don't want to do this for a living, to be able to stay in school. That was my long-term vision for the overall project. And, of course, I just wanted to educate the most powerful but ignorant force in the world, which is the modern-day church. Know what you're talking about if you're going to slam this stuff, or if you're going to try to – these are people's kids, and they're watching them go off and do this stuff. Most of the folks that I ever met came from, you see interviews. Yeah, my parents, this and that, pastors, and there was even one show on HBO I watched where there was a couple that came out of seminary, and they're one of the most prolific performers. And I thought, wow, we are missing the boat on this one. So what I wanted to do was discuss it in a way that forced the church to become educated in its own ideology before it just became this, don't do it because I say it's, well, you know what? The graham cracker was invented to try to be a remedy for sex therapy. This is, stuff I found out as I was researching. And so I had to throw in some incidentals, like the character loves basketball. I give the audience a language to relate to that has nothing to do with sex. I have a professor who's giving this lecture from the point of view of 75 years in our future, so that we have the comfort of knowing, well, it's not the end of the world. It's just another speed bump in history. And this is how we got there. So, from that point of view, it allows the audience to explore that world and discover it, as opposed to being bored out of their minds, like, frankly, watching Son of God, which, again, was made for baby Christians, so, they did exactly what they set out to do. That's the novel, that's the purpose, and I've gotten a lot of positive, I've got talent that has attached themselves Joe D'Onofrio was the first one to read the script and just say, hey, we have to do this. And I'm like, you're right. But I refuse to make crap. So we're going to hold on and wait for funding properly. And our distribution globally was just a train wreck. You know, I'm talking to Fox and I drop in names and they're like, sure, you can hire us to distribute. And I'm like, isn't this supposed to work the other way around? And I had to completely change my approach, which has, you know, turned into more time. I did create a 30-minute short, stars a guy named Wayman Tisdale who, some people have no idea who he was. One of the biggest basketball stars of the 80s. Started my first film and then he passed away a few years ago. I wasn't a Christian when I met him and he was getting out of the NBA and that lifestyle. And he appeared in my film and it was a patched together movie. The plot is there. That's all I say. We didn't have a lot of money. Now we're looking at doing this on a larger scale. And as I pitched it to Brad Stein, I don't know if you know who he is. Brad is considered the hottest Christian comic in the world. If you ask any major church leader, you know Brad Stein? Oh, Brad's hilarious. He's the Robin Williams of his genre. Okay, and he asked me, he says, I want to do something crossover. I said, well, I've got something here that's really cool. You know how Robin Williams did Good Morning Vietnam, where you have Vietnam, heavy topic, but you've got this hilarious counterweight. It's the same vibe as MASH. I said, Brad, here's what I want to do. I want to stick you in every frame like Stallone, you know, where you're in every frame. Either making a smirk or making a joke or making a statement that is so true, people are laughing at the irony. And then I'm going to have the action going on behind you, kind of like when Ferris Bueller broke the plane. So I said, let's do this. And then we talked to Kevin Sorbo about playing the central character's father. He's a wonderful father figure as far as the cinema goes. And Joe D'Onofrio from Goodfellas plays, you know, the anti-hero. I had the nightclub manager character who is trying to control the temperature in hell, as he puts it. We don't know until later on in the story. He used to go to church with some of the, you know, heroic characters. And then, of course, you got the main guy whose testimony puts an end to the porn industry, at least legally. And his movies have the supernatural power to heal, meaning when and he doesn't know why. His movie is shown, it seems to have this kind of aura to it, that people either experience severe heart pressure, heart attacks, or they fly into charismatic worship. Again, he doesn't know why, but God seems to go, boom, you're touched, which alienates him from the very people he wanted to work for in his life, which it makes it very clear. You know, God says, I'm going to do this other thing with you, and he's fighting with it. Brad was completely drawn to that. So he attached himself, and he said, you know what, do what you got to do to get it funded. I'm in. Kevin's a work for hire guy now too. He was alienated by his own statement of faith with, you know, he wasn't even allowed to cameo in the Hercules movie, but since they bombed, you know, who really missed out? So here I am in Denver. God told me to come to Denver. I was in California. I was up the street from where a lot of the stuff in Chatsworth, you know, when I'm writing the story, it's where it all happened. And at first I thought I was going to be there, and the Lord was like, no, you're going to go over here. And my plan was New York. I have a family that was connected to Jonathan Demme back when he was a name, and I thought I'm going to go to New York, work for Lorne Michaels, learn how to do Saturday Night Live, and, you know, do the Jimmy Fallon path. And he said, no, you're going to Denver. And of course I asked, where's Denver? So here I am. I'm able to write. The digital book world has reinvented the press. It has forced us all to re-examine our approach to filmmaking. I can't afford to spend $150 million on ideas at this point. I'm not there. Jerry Bruckheimer is even finding out he's human. So what we're doing is we're working with the advantages that the spiritual strongholds that existed when I was in LA are not here. Now, granted, the unions need work, they need organization, but it's a great place to reset. That's why I'm in Colorado. I was raised in Arizona, where a lot of the stuff I witnessed happened. In fact, I think a couple of the guys that are really successful right now with the online stuff are based in Scottsdale. I can't confirm that, but that's what I read on their URLs. So that having been said, you know, you've got a colorful history. You're known by a few names. You know, you've certainly gone through a certain spiritual curve. Let me ask you, what's your interest? Am I answering your questions? I'm trying to hit the bullet points as I might interview somebody here.
So when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Pick an age.
8.
You said 8? 8?
Yeah.
You know, I saw Star Wars and I never looked back. I was deeply moved by the natural. I think every kid loved falling in love with Rocky and wishing he was a real character. A light in the dark. My dad was a very optimistic guy, very positive influence on me, a very serving guy. I'll even go further to say that this is hard to prove, but true. And someday, if you ask, I'll establish the paper trail. My dad was the basis for why Al Pacino was cast as Michael in The Godfather. My granddad worked for Joey Bonanno back in Jersey. I didn't learn that until I researched it for a novel called The Faithful. And he walked away from that life because he felt God calling him west. And he at first thought, okay, New Mexico, and there was an Indian reservation there, and he thought, I'm going to go and I'm going to rescue the poor. Well, like the Count of Monte Cristo, God trained him his way. And he wound up in Arizona when things didn't work out in New Mexico, and he became a cop, and he learned how to be the instrument of ministry that he was designed to be by being a policeman. And his favorite thing to do was go in and play the SRO with the kids. Well, when my dad, the cop, shows up with a bunch of Wildcat trading cards in my middle school, having to talk about say no to drugs, be, safe with sex, and he's even trained to be a volunteer Catholic deacon. I mean, that really spoke to me. So it's a very strong presence in my life. And then, of course, was the impact that I had with learning what George Lucas was able to accomplish. Between him and the fact my mother would always say, Steven Spielberg grew up the street. And it wasn't until I saw Amblin and I recognized the actual patch of dirt that he shot his movie on. I'm like, hey, I shot my movie on the same dirt. And reality set in. And then when I met him years later, I was a tour guide. He used to come out and greet the tour guides as we would get initiated into the giant shark. We had to learn how to pull the kickstand and have it rewind back into the water. And I realized I didn't want to be him. I realized I was not George Lucas. In fact, it took the last few years for the Lord to speak to my heart and say, stop planning for yesterday. I'm going to do something new with you. And the book started opening up. So I had to find new role models. Homelessness is an apt teacher. So I'll say that during some very dark hours, I found myself reading the biographies of Ronald Reagan and Martin Luther King, and I just fell in love with them. I'm trying to speak in broad strokes here. I don't know if I'm hitting all your...
How are Christians perceived in the movie industry, the entertainment industry?
Individuals or the genre?
Christians as individuals.
How do I think they're perceived?
Yeah. Like when you go try to get projects going in the entertainment industry, you're talking as a Christian.
Okay.
How does that work?
There's two types that I come across. The first is the type where we click. There's a central, and it really depends on how secure the person is in their own faith. Because I've come to realize that Romans 10:9 is a very broad verse. God is not even asking for an emotional connection. He's asking for an intellectual acknowledgement of the resurrection. Did the history thing happen or not? When I come across folks that are addicted to works, there are issues. When I come across folks who are very secure in their own faith, we get along really well to the point where the tongues get loose, the body language is relaxed, and we speak our minds. And that's when I think ministry really happens. Now, when I'm talking to somebody who is on autopilot self-defensiveness about wherever they are in their relationship with their maker, and their ideology is that, they discern that there is not a condonement from me, and there's a sense of self-defensiveness there, we don't get along. Now, my best example I can give at the moment is when I talked to Jim Caviezel's former voice manager. The man is outspokenly gay. And I didn't go there with him. I just talked about voice work, retainer, Jim's availability. He was balancing some things. We ended up not doing it because it turns out that computer apps cover the very thing we were going to have him record by voice. But I was staying good friends with one of his old acting coaches. And it got back to me that it turns out Jim had fired this guy because he had mouthed off to some of his supporters. And Jim is charismatic Catholic as you're going to get. And he said, I respect the fact that you wanted to go out and get me work, but when your stances stand in the way of the very people who made me, I'm going to tell you point blank, I got a problem with that. Now, I've talked to people that, their heads are so far in the clouds. I listened to one fella who was convinced that Jack Nicholson was a satanic priest. And, for years I bought it until I met people that had worked with him that said, no, he's done a lot of research for movies, but those are different things. And I went, I feel like an idiot for believing that. On the flip side, it really comes down to how are we perceived? Those who are committed to their own opinions are going to think we're the haters. They're going to say anything we say is hate. We're ruling things out. At the same time, we come off as ignorant, unfortunately. I think Kirk Cameron gives our industry a black eye, whereas I think that movies like Machine Gun Preacher should be The Apostle, 21 Grams. These are brilliant forms of filmmaking. And when I see guys like Matthew McConaughey get up on the Oscars and basically praise God for his life and his awards and his health, that's noteworthy to me. That makes a difference. I think got to remember what the platform is there for and use it properly. I think they should have a shot clock for those guys. But anyway, I don't know if I answered that question directly enough for you.
What's it like being not Jewish in a Jewish industry?
Boy, I guess I don't perceive the media as a Jewish industry anymore. It used to be. I remember when Beverly Dean, who managed Jim, when I met her, and she opened a lot of doors for me just before retiring, I asked her that. And she said, the only people that have really come to my aid as a Christian are Jewish. The other Christians ask me for money. And she even joked, she said most of the time Christian works get financed by not other Christians, but Jews who were trying to piss off Palestine. And I just died laughing when I heard that. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. I guess I'll say this. The only time I felt a racism about my faith amidst a Jewish community, it was completely apart from the entertainment industry. And every time I've been in the entertainment industry and people would say, well, I'm Jewish, we would strike up a very faint conversation about some things. But I would basically say to them, I'm secure enough where I'm at to let you be where you are. And if you're curious about something, ask away. And if you're not, then I'll leave you alone. And if what I believe offends you, well, I guess we're going to part ways here. And in some cases that has worked marvelously. In other cases that has been God's filter to say, you don't need this person. As far as financing goes, to my knowledge, it hasn't played a role. To my knowledge, it hasn't cost me a deal. Usually, those who are really good at their jobs do not factor that in. One, they can't. Two, they just don't because it's not smart business. But from maybe a script development process, it really comes down to what are you trying to make and who's really in charge of the pulse of the story. Does it serve the story that way? I don't know if that answers because I haven't been in the position a lot of being, Swordfish technically, but we were all background extras and everybody had an opinion and it was late night and John Travolta couldn't have been nicer. So it's like the A-list came out and when Dominic said it was getting his stuff together on certain sequences and it was one of my third or fourth things to be on. And I remember there was a few guys who claimed to be Jewish, but they were saying it, but they didn't know anything about the Torah and they didn't know anything about anything regarding the Old Testament. And I thought, well, you can call yourself it, but I mean, I can call myself a Cubs fan, or a baseball player, but just because I've been to the stadium doesn't make me on the payroll. So anyway, I haven't experienced industry racism on that. A couple of times I've had people say, well, this offends me. I'm like, well, you're coming to me. It's like standing on my porch and saying, I don't like the way you did your garden. Get off my porch and you'll love the world a lot more. Turn around, look that way if you don't like this way. And predominantly people seem to respect that. The ones that don't, again, God will just take them away. And my dad used to have an expression, Corey, don't hate them. They don't just do it to you. They do it to everybody. I find that to be the most true, regardless of their perspective. Does that make enough sense?
Yeah. Well, where did you go to high school?
Where did I go to high school? Oh, I got paroled from a place called Santa Rita. It was in Tucson. Very mediocre school in Tucson Unified School District. It was, in fact, I think I was on the border, the way they did the districting from that and another school. That's where I went.
What do you mean you got paroled?
My dad had died midway through my senior year, so there was some struggles I went from being an A student to discovering film, and as it turns out, the least supported activity in the curriculum was what I was interested in. So my grades took a dive. Again, I started going through the morning process. I was really rescued by a couple of teachers and a counselor who was determined to make sure I walked the graduation line, which I did. Years later, I found out that the principal had been commissioned by a political lobbyist group to try to destroy my father's reputation on the job. And bottom line was, he was a cop with seniority, he was a Christian, and he opposed a lot of other types of thinking. He got cancer, he was dying, he died. They said, back off. The man is dying of cancer and he's dead. And from there, they basically said, make sure nothing happens to his son for, had about another year that was emotionally draining, but the grace of God. I had to start healing sometime. See, when you lose a parent, it's heavy. When you lose a parent that the name's street after because this guy served everybody, to me, what's the difference between, it's the difference between a ball player that gets sent back down to the minors versus losing Babe Ruth. Well, Tucson lost Babe Ruth, and he happened to be my dad. And that's, so when I say I got paroled, I have very little respect for my high school because of all of the corners that they cut and of all the opportunities that were lost. I spent many years after the fact. In fact, I married a teacher who helped guide me through my last couple of years of college. She gave birth to her third during my senior year, or junior, whatever it was. Yeah, that school was overrated. They almost set us up for failure. Yeah. Wasted.
What was your dad's name?
His first name was Joe. My first legal name is Joseph.
So Joe Paroff? Is that?
The last name is Parella.
Parella, sorry.
No, it's okay. Everybody butchers it. There's a little township in Italy called Parella. Somebody at some point came from there. Visited Oklahoma, married in with the Indians, went back because of the Civil War, and then came back. I wrote about it in The Faithful, which is one of the novels I wrote that we're going to be selling next week.
How did you get into the sex industry?
You mean this side of it? Gosh.
No, when you like working in town or working in strip clubs?
I couldn't get a job. That's really the story behind witness protection. I was a Caucasian living in a town where you needed to be bilingual or brown, and I was neither.
You mean Tucson?
Yes. I talk about that a lot in the novel. Actually, both of them. Racism it's a remnant of the Spanish Armada. C.S. Lewis wrote about it. If you read the novels, the Spanish Armada is the human villains. The remnant of it there is they are, unfortunately, Latino first and their ideology second. If you switch that, you're living the dream Martin Luther King described. As far as how I got involved, I literally went job hunting without a college degree, and I couldn't get a look at fast food. I couldn't get a look at any of the jobs. Call centers were even starting to wind down because they were eliminating telemarketing. And I have a voice that I did DJing for 10 years. I didn't pay very well. Excuse me, fighting a sinus infection here. So one of the last places I worked up the courage to walk into was this dive of a strip club. And I thought, I'm actually going to do this. So I walk in, and, 10 minutes later, a guy throws me a T-shirt, and he says, if you can show up, you're hired. And I thought, okay. What I didn't know was that it's the highest likelihood of getting a cold. Biggest enemy of those places is illness, worse than an elementary school. Of course, getting wrapped up with the social life is hazardous to your health. Not because they're trying to beat you up, but because the girls are carrying stuff, and the boys too. Drugs flew in and out of there like, an airport at Christmas. And of course, the owners try to walk around like they're all these shady characters from a Martin Scorsese movie. So I used a lot of that as a basis. Later on, I wrote about it. And I wrote, why are people coming in for this? Oh, they want to pay for romance or pay for a love that the church is completely fumbling when it comes to matchmaking. They were lonely. They were looking for love, and this is the format in which they would find it. Most of the dancers were starving. Most of the bouncers were too. A lot of addictions, being fed, being underwritten there. A lot of the clientele also desperate. You could see where the future clients of online dating were going to come from. And, you know, it was one place where there was really no discrimination inside those walls. It was all about using chocolate to feed the masses like Jesus fed them with fish and bread. You know, yeah, it'll satisfy your body for the first few minutes, but you eat too much chocolate, it'll kill you. You know, you need the bread. You need the healthy stuff. And unfortunately, that was the only job I could get. And I witnessed a lot of dark stuff. You know, when ambulances would take the girls home more often than their, you know, conceived rides or taxis after the shift, that's a problem. And
why were the ambulances taking girls home?
Drugs took their toll. Visitors would come in, and every parasite you can think of would feast on vulnerable people. It was the opposite end. When my dad worked as a cop, he didn't just work he worked in narcotics. American Gangster, Serpico. My dad did that. So I was seeing everything from the opposite point of view, but I didn't have a badge or a gun to back me up. I couldn't go, get in here. He had that advantage and cleaned up a lot of things and saved a lot of lives. I was on the other end of it, and what can I say? I saw a lot of dark things, and I thought someday I'm going to write about this. There's a lot of people who don't need to be here. But then, you know, the lie that Satan feeds you is you're not clean enough to go into the church and hang out, which unfortunately the Tucson Catholic Diocese did a remarkable job of endorsing because their own priests were sexually assaulting children. So they successfully grew the Protestant church. You know, again, I made international headlines. They did 3 different documentaries. 2 of them won Oscars. I'm not the only one who has cited that. I do know that the only reason I wasn't accosted at the private school I went to as a kid who was Catholic was that they knew my dad was a narc cop. But the priests basically looked at each other and said, you touch him, his dad's going to kill you. Nobody's going to convict his dad of murder. It's not going to happen.
How long were you working in strip clubs?
Collectively about 1.5 years.
And did you have any experience in the porn industry?
No, I never jumped on camera. There was one brief moment where I almost did. I was 20. And, you know, the hand of God just kept me out of it.
What kind of women become strippers?
Kind of women? Desperate. All shapes, all sizes, all languages. Desperation was the number one fuel. I saw a few older ones who were there because they enjoyed the idea of, I don't know, freedom, identity in it. You know, one described herself as a capitalist. I don't know what that meant. They didn't make enough money to get rich in this. There wasn't enough money flowing through the clubs unless, you know, somebody was trucking heroin in, and I didn't see it. It was almost like an overglorified cross between a prom and a homeless shelter the entire time. Oh, excuse me. Hi, get your stuff. My son.
What is the book Repeat After Me?
Repeat After Me is Joe Cavallari's biography. He was, still is, the Ooh-Ah Man. It is his story. Do you want me to continue on that?
Yeah.
Okay. Joe Cavallari started off as just another guy from New York. Italian from New York, late 60s, early 70s, had some basketball ability. He was 6'4", and he came west because his family had found its way to Arizona. And he was invited to a baseball game back when the Wildcats were, actually it was before it was at an interim time. Jerry Kindle had just been hired as the new head coach. And the crowd was sedated. It was a very calm, passive crowd. It was kind of boring. They went in, they'd have a few drinks, they tried to liven things up and have some fun. He and a couple of friends went. And as it turns out, he would do these cheers to try to get the game to be more interesting. And after a while, he realized the crowd was responding to his cheers. And there was a point where they realized that the crowd's involvement was affecting the outcome of the game. And the coaches noticed this, and they invited him in and said, Would you be willing to do this at all the major televised games? So you had baseball, you had football, and you had college basketball coming to pass as color TV and cable TV were coming to pass. So he would go, and he not only went in, he had like this almost a superhero uniform he'd put on. So you've got this 6'4" Italian guy with long hair forming the word Arizona, and he would point to the crowd, and they'd get excited, and they'd cheer, and it was interactive, and suddenly there was energy there. And because of that, the teams won more games than they would have. And it is notably, every coach says, because of Joe Cavalieri, we won games that we would have lost. And with Arizona's success under Kendall, under, I could rattle off a dozen coaches' names, primarily Lute Olson, a man I just adore, hence the faithful. He acknowledged, especially when they played in the national championship Final Four game against North Carolina, they were down 15-6. And I always thought, what did Coach Olson tell them? He called a timeout to gather his team up, and then Joe's the one who actually told me the story. And he said, this is back, he didn't have security clearance to go onto the floor like he would have at McHale Center at the home game. And so he is sitting in the little tiny confined section where they had the Wildcat fans in Indianapolis. And he's surrounded by North Carolina and Kentucky fans, and he starts ripping it. He would remove his clothing as he's doing the cheers to get people really going. And he's doing this, and he gets the crowd screaming U of A to the point where some people don't even know what's being screamed. Our players heard it, responded, they won the game. And it made history. And in that particular season, that particular year, the city experienced an Easter Sunday along the lines of the resurrection. It was different in Tucson for a year. Every ethnicity was high-fiving each other in the streets. I've never seen anything like it. The city had an orgasm. In fact, I have that sentence written in the book. I was going to be on the cover. I'm like, they won't let me put that on the book. Tucson had an orgasm. Anyway, Joe was a guy who wanted to play professional ball. The truth is, I don't think Joe would have ever had enough talent to play professional ball, but he got all the other stuff. He is probably the most famous Wildcat, more so than any of the players that have ever gone through the program. Lute sent like 150, something insane, players to the NBA. Joe has more stage time logged. And about a little bit less than 2 years ago, I was starting to scribe a couple of other Wildcat stories. It's something that was dear to me. I wanted to tell their stories through the lens of the Bible. And I contacted him and I said, can I interview you? You probably know these guys better than anybody. I mean, who knows them better than, the guy who was cheering right next to the bench where they're catching their breath ready to go back out and play. He's like, yeah, sure, anytime. Well, it turns out Parkinson's had set in. And it had claimed his finances and it claimed his health. And at one point, this was about, last September. And he had said, hey, you want to write my life story? And I'm like, well, put together a bunch of email addresses we could market to and maybe we'll talk. And at first it didn't seem like an appealing idea. Then he posted an announcement that said the bank was claiming his home at auction and he was begging somebody to please buy it so he could buy it, or, lease it back from him. And these apathetic responses were appearing, and I'm like, in a world of crowdfunding and social networks and Wildcat Nation, in which Lute Olson has trained up basketball players to become millionaires, and this guy who cheered them on when, frankly, they were playing like crap that year, excuse me, somebody out there cares enough to make sure we can either buy off this guy's house mortgage or help him find another place after they, do what they're going to do with the house. So I launched an Indiegogo campaign that caught on to a local news, and bang, Wildcat Nation responded. The amount of money that was donated was just enough to stave off the sale of his home. It bought him time. And then he started sharing with me his story. And this is a guy with Parkinson's. He can barely walk. He can barely talk. His typing is so schizo that I have to ask him for certain facts and details like 10 times and cross-reference them. Parkinson's. I don't have Parkinson's, but he does. And I'm learning a lot about it. Anyway, I thought, what would my father have done? And I'm pretty sure that when I was a little kid, he took me to a ball game and he and Joe met each other. Somewhere there's a photograph of the two together. I get a little choked up about this. Sorry. My dad was the type, he would have gone to the house, he would have given him money, he would have helped them move, he would have done something. And I thought, what can I do? I can tell his story. And I thought, with the publishing industry the way it is, let me tell his story. And then not only did we tell the story, but everybody jumped in and wanted to be a part of it. And they really liked the hook I was describing to, in which I compared what he was doing to Joshua, shouting at Jericho. And then I later tied in the whole Moses thing of prophet, open thy mouth and speak. Anyway, he resisted that a little, but over time he realized, okay, yeah, maybe doing the cheers did sway. I said, you created an ambiance that made Wildcat Nation it made McHale Center a home court advantage. And every other team in the league seemed to respond to that and imitate it, to the point where they all now have their loud cheering sections and people who get out there and, do one of these. I said, Joe, you started it all. We have to do this. So I learned a lot about Parkinson's. I learned a lot about the legal process, that he was going through. What do you do when you're not Michael J. Fox and you have Parkinson's? As I would say, Fox has money from his acting days, very well invested, and Parkinson's. Joe only has Parkinson's. And everybody could relate to that. So I decided, let's put this thing out there. And it wasn't just about dealing with Parkinson's. It was about what did it mean to articulate bear down? What did that really mean? And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the kids that aren't born and raised in Tucson choose to go to Arizona, is they fall in love with that same thing, to dig deep. And I quote a scripture at the very end that articulates what bear down means, and it's about self-sacrifice. And I said, Joe, you articulated that with what you did. And he even described how, I don't know if you remember the movie Field of Dreams, where Burt Lancaster plays the Moonlight Graham. And he has that Frank Wiley plays the young version of him, and his at-bat kind of gets passed over. And that was his only moment in the major leagues where he really would have had a chance to get a hit. Well, Joe described his own experiences in basketball like that. And I went, we got Field of Dreams here. And that's what really sold me on the story. Now, this was an average guy who, he drank, he womanized, and then when the call came, he got up and he cheered for other people. He served. He epitomized it. And that's a message that everybody has really gotten into in the last, 6 months. I just got a touch on Facebook from the president of the student body, who's like, we need this more than you realize. And again, I live in Denver, where they're all about the Broncos. And so to hear just how much it's having a positive impact to the place where I grew up, and that's the whole point. I left because it was dark. I wanted to bring the light in, and this is accomplishing that. And since he still lives there, I wanted his family taken care of. I wanted to make sure that he's got, kids and grandkids, not quite grown yet, just coming into the world. I want them to have a legacy, and the university agreed with me on this. The AD and I had a couple chats about it. They want to make sure that Joe is remembered properly, because he did more in 30 years than many other coaches ever did, to benefit the city and the program. I'm sure I reversed that.
What's your book, The Faithful, about?
This is my heart and soul in about 2,000 pages. The Faithful is two life stories. Two men I admire, my heroes, Lute Olson and my dad. They crossed paths like this. Whereas they were not great friends, they did not know each other. Coach Olson, when I interviewed him over months' time, did not remember meeting my father. But because of the descriptions that my dad would, he went into the coach's office and met with him and his staff, and everybody else remembered my dad coming in and visiting with the players. The story is this: they used trading cards of the team as a diplomacy tool to solve a very real problem on the Apascua Yaqui Reservation on the west side of Tucson. Today there's a casino there because my dad went in and evicted all the drug dealers out of it. And he won over the tribe after a century of betrayal by handing out these sports trading cards to the kids and befriending them and loving on them and becoming sort of a part of the tribe in the way it was operating. And what I did is I showed how the story takes place from the judgment seat of Christ. So you've got my dad dying of cancer in the beginning. Very sad opening chapter, and then boom, he's in heaven and he's feeling good. and you've got this experience of Jesus judging him. It's very powerful. So then I cut back and forth between the spiritual aspect of how God was using Lute Olson to change the lives of the people that he came across, especially his destiny in Tucson. And then I show my dad the same way, coming from afar to do the exact same thing, but one is a coach, one is a cop. And these are their life stories from the perspective of judgment. Coach Olson was very taken by the idea of speaking to his first wife again in heaven. And that's why I think he agreed to do the project in the first place. He agreed to, let me use all of his stuff to do that. I have his first wife. She was a born-again Christian. He was more of a Lutheran, kind of an intellectual side of it. Both very parental, very educated, very loving, and they were the parent figures that the city really needed. Well, my parents echoed that in the police department, and I thought these two people who never really met, and they just barely touched when it came to the sports stuff. I always wanted to tell the story of the Wildcats. I always thought the legacy was beautiful. It needed to be done right. I didn't trust the scribes of the Arizona Daily Star. They, in fact, bothered me. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to tell these two stories. At first, I was going to tell them separately. And then as I was writing them, I realized I'm telling the exact same story, and it's a mirror image. It's a symmetrical mirror image of itself. So I combined the two, and I pitched it to Coach Olson. And he's like, yeah, that sounds really neat. Go ahead and do it. And last year, we were a click away from funding, and I won't get into it now, but didn't work out. And so the march goes on. The fact that they both had such colorful stories turned this into, Dances with Wolves overnight. The fact that my dad actually did all the stuff that you see fictionally portrayed, by the Kevin Costner, John Dunbar character. The fact that he was derived from the real-life mafia of The Godfather. The fact that, Coach Olson, as a teenager, did the very stuff you saw in Hoosiers. And I'm like, we have to make this, So I've always wanted to tell the history of Tucson. There's two enemies that the city faces, and I felt that a novel could overcome those enemies, and The Faithful was my tool to do that. The first enemy was racism. If one chooses to carry their faith above their ethnicity, racism is conquered. I quote Martin Luther King in the first page. I also give an homage, quoting Elton John. This is from The Kid in the 22nd Row. The other aspect of Tucson is mediocrity is rewarded there. Lute Olson exercised mediocrity, meaning he overcame it by winning the 1997 national championship. The basketball team has one national championship. The softball team has, I believe, 9. Other sport programs there, lacrosse, track field, golf, whatever, have collectively like hundreds of national championships. They didn't name National Championship Drive after anybody else but the basketball team. Why? The answer to that sparked my interest in writing The Faithful. It's a story about a faithful God, despite who loved us before we were, anything. I quote the verse in the story. That's why I wrote that. I wanted people to have a portrait of the city correctly.
What do you think of the Triple X Church?
The Triple X Judge. Help me out.
Triple X Church.
Oh, I can't stand them.
Why?
Arrogant, self-seeking. They strike me as guys that make money off of perpetuating the existence of scandal rather than actually addressing problems. I talked to Craig Gross. I talked to Donnie Pauling, both a couple of pompous guys that I'm not going to curse them out over here. I actually wrote an adaptation of Witness Protection with an opening essay called Correcting Everything About It. And I denounced them as being opportunistic, elitist, aristocratic manipulators of... They use religion to sell guilt. None of their philosophies are remotely accurate. I watched Ron Jeremy debate the guy. Ron's got a master's degree in special ed. What the hell has Craig Gross got? He's got a web address, and he manipulated the heck out of the Triple X. The Triple X Church website is catchy. Their software is pointless. I even downloaded it. It wouldn't work. It's a filter that you can actually wire Yahoo and Google to do what it's supposed to do. So, they really got defensive when I tried to contact them. They were really mean about it, and I realized they have no substance, or at least too little. They are looking to be booked as public speakers. The problem is they have little to no authority and little to no credibility. of course, they're safe for their political alliances. So yeah, they're going to get invited now and then to churches who don't know the difference. We're about to be invaded by my dog.
So what are they doing wrong? Like they try to help people who are addicted to porn or people who are working in the porn industry to get out.
Everything they're doing is works-based. It's guilt-based. It's, when you ask Craig Gross, well, what's the problem? And he actually stifles and goes, I'm not really saying there's a problem. I'm like, actually, you are. So what is the problem, Craig? And they don't have an answer. When it comes to, marriage counseling, when it comes to what the Scripture actually says, these guys do not have a scriptural basis for any of their arguments. Hold on just a second. Sorry I'm so loud. Sorry, it's bedtime for the kids. I'm sorry, where were we in the questioning?
I was trying to figure what's wrong with what they're doing. They're trying to help people break out of addiction.
Okay. You mentioned the word addiction. In my opinion, there's no direct connection between photography and lust. Lust predates photography by, 6,900 years? There's no direct connection. Indirect connection the industry is built on. Also, it's not addiction, it's obsessive compulsive. There's a big difference there. I've been looking at this now for a while. Addiction is when, you're pouring the drugs in, when you're injecting. Yeah, I got a long night. Let's see. They are, pushing something that is works-based. Ephesians 2:8, the gospel is not works-based. And what they're doing is pushing, one moment, please. Can you stop throwing stuff down right now? I mean, really, close the door then. No, I don't. Fine. Stop throwing things down. Celebrate 12 wonderful years in December.
What's wrong with works-based? I mean, earlier in the interview you said you don't get along with people who are works-based. What's wrong with people who are works-based or the approach that is works-based?
When it comes from the heart, when there's we're not defined by our works. How do I say this? I want to make sure I'm quoted accurately. Ephesians 2:8-9 says there's not a single thing that we can do to make ourselves holy. That's something that Christ imputes on us. Christ gives us that. It's a line of credit from on high. So for the worst answer and the only answer I have ever heard about the evils of interacting with virtual sex is that it makes God look bad. It embarrasses God. That was the worst example I ever heard. It's also the most consistent example I've ever heard. When Jesus talks about adultery, it really goes back to Ephesians 5:21. If your spouse doesn't want you to, then you submit. Like right now, I'm being told to get the hell off the Skype. We'll wrap up soon enough. It's about submitting to your spouse in the love of Christ. Okay? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, respect your husbands, and so on. And what these guys are preaching is if you don't process a visual with your retina that has an effect on your genitalia that causes you to respond, then you're holy or you're pure. The problem is that's works. And then I got into this detail. How many yanks does a baseball player on a pitcher's mound have to do to his cup in order to qualify as masturbation? Or what's more unsafe? What's more of an issue? Having sex alone with yourself or sharing those skin rubs with another? And then, of course, you get into all the sub-arguments of same gender and then, it goes on and on. So what these guys are doing is they're saying, look at me, listen to what I have to say, I'm the expert, and here's the answer. Don't look at that. Well, can a blind man not lust? Blind people can lust just fine. They don't have the ability to see it at all. So lust and photography are not connected. on that alone, the Triple X Church is completely whacked. Because long before we had the internet, hence the Triple X Church, people went to stores to look at this stuff. I mean, Deep Throat is considered unofficially the top grossing film of all time. You know, I remember I sat and watched the bio they did. James Franco played Hugh Hefner. I thought it was brilliant. So much so that I had a hard time finding an audience because it wasn't like Pulp Fiction. It was based on the real stuff. Linda herself became a Christian before she died. Harry Reams, the same thing. I even reached out to him, and he's like, I don't want any part of this because I wanted him to contribute as a tech advisor. He just wasn't there. He didn't have the capacity, and eventually, I guess, he got really, really sick, and it's just, it wasn't his role to be involved. That's my issue with these guys. They're offering the cure for cancer when they have none. They're offering a Band-Aid. They're offering aspirin. They're not offering a cure for cancer. Frankly, it's not cancer. It's obsessive-compulsive at best, and at worst, I always tell my friends at Bible studies, if you want to solve this in your own home, look at Ephesians 5:21. If your spouse is not comfortable with it, then stay away from it. Period. If your spouse doesn't care, then just remember safety first. Because once you start opening the bedroom door, I promise you illness will find you. Or depression. Or something like that.